are back. Hi everyone, thank you for tuning in, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Henrik Palmgren from Sweden, and this is Red Eyes Radio. We come to you 3 times per week. You can tune in at redeyescreations.com, where we have a lot more programs available for you, as well as videos, news, and other resources. We cover a lot of topics: interviews, research, opinions, and analysis. More importantly, we do not shy away from covering the controversial, bring a light into the shadows to expose the problems of corruption, the hidden agendas, and the politically incorrect. And we go past the designated stop signs and the here but no further programmed responses that unfortunately most alternative channels fail to go beyond and continue to inquire further. As we know, the authentic answers and truth can be very uncomfortable to learn, but we are all about understanding and learning wherever it may lead. We are going to pick up on the Ukraine situation today. We have with us Paul Craig Roberts, who joins us for an hour. He has had careers in scholarship and academia, journalism, public service, and business. He is chairman at the Institute for Political Economy. He is probably best known as the former head of policy at the Department of Treasury under Reagan and the editor of the Wall Street Journal. He has written several books, including The Tyranny of Good Intentions and How the Economy Was Lost. He is also known for reporting on many of the geopolitical events and the workings of the Treasury and the Federal Reserve. We have a lot to discuss, so stay with us. Mr. Paul Craig Roberts, welcome, and thank you for joining us here at Red Eyes Radio. It's great to have you with us. Hope you're doing well today.
Well, thank you.
Excellent. It's great to have you here, and there's certainly no lack of issues to discuss. There's just a tremendous amount of things happening in the world. But let's begin and touch a little bit upon the situation in the Ukraine specifically. You've done some really good analysis and looking at this situation. It's very important, of course, and this can easily lead to bigger developments that we've seen before. I wanted to discuss your analysis of the situation a bit here and what you think is the reasoning behind the Washington-backed coup in Kiev that we've seen, and why it's been so important for them to not only take control of the country, but to try to put their own puppets in place in the Ukraine. Is this just to fight the proxy war with Russia, or what is the bigger picture here, Paul?
Well, this is based on the well-known American foreign policy doctrine and strategic doctrine known as the Wolfowitz doctrine, after Paul Wolfowitz, who was the Deputy Secretary of Defense in charge of policy. The doctrine states that the United States government must prevent the rise of any other country that's large enough and could control enough people and resources to present the U.S. with a global challenge. It explicitly singles out Russia and says that Russia must not be able to rise to sufficient status or power to prevent a check on Washington's will equivalent to that presented by the Soviet Union. So the purpose of the Ukraine is to weaken the Soviet Union, to Russia, to present it with a strategic threat in its own backyard that will distract it from American purposes in Syria and Iran and elsewhere, and which can be used, the strategic threat, which can be used to break up the Russian Federation and to restart the Cold War. If you'll notice, Russia and the president of Russia, Putin, have been consistently demonized by blatant propaganda.
Oh, yeah.
And the purpose is to create, there are several purposes. One is to create fear and unease in the Baltics and Eastern Europe, Poland, in order to build up NATO forces in those areas on Russia's border, in order to convince the American public that Russia is now the enemy. You know, it's no longer Al-Qaeda, it's now Russia. It's a much more serious threat. And we have to continue the oversized military security complex budgets and spending of hundreds of billions of dollars every year in order to contain the Russian threat. And these are sort of the main purposes of this demonization and this propaganda. And of course, also a purpose is to break up Europe's trade relations with Russia.
Right.
So that's essentially what it was all about. The United States has been after Ukraine for a long time. In 2004, Washington financed what was known as the Orange Revolution.
Exactly, yes.
And the revolution succeeded, but it failed to deliver Ukraine to Washington. So for the next 10 years, Washington poured $5 billion into Ukraine, grooming politicians who would be stooges for Washington, financing non-governmental organizations that would serve as Washington's fifth columns. And so when the Ukrainian government rejected the opportunity to join the EU, Washington sent these NGOs out into the streets with protests demanding that the government change its mind. That's how this coup was set up. Then these ultra-nationalists, sometimes called neo-Nazis, they came on the scene, introduced violence, changed the nature of the demands from joining the EU to overthrowing the government. And the parliament had enough of Washington stooges in it to vote to disband the police. So the government was left without protection and had to flee. And that's how the United States was able to put in office the current members of the so-called Ukrainian government, a government that's not elected, that was installed by Washington. And so the effect of the words and deeds of Washington's stooges in Kiev was to alarm the Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine. Significant parts of the Ukraine are actually Russian territories that were added to the Ukraine by Communist Party leaders during the Soviet era.
That's right.
But they're traditional Russian areas, and when they were told that they were a threat to Ukraine, that the Russian language was abolished as any kind of official language or a language used in communications, and various violent acts and deeds, the Russian areas began agitating for independence or to return to Russia. The Crimea pulled this off, and now other areas in eastern Ukraine, Luhansk and the Donetsk areas, they have also voted independence and asked to be reincorporated in Russia. And of course, that's what the Russian government needs to do, but Putin knows if he does that, it gives the United States more propaganda to use against Russia with the European Union and with Germany. And
right.
And so he's kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. If he doesn't take them in, he will lose support with Russian nationalists, and he'll lose credibility, and he'll look weak, and the West will push him harder. But if he does, then he loses any chance that America, or Washington rather, is pushing its European puppet states too hard, because they don't really want to lose their economic relationships with Russia, and they don't really want to be brought into a military conflict with Russia. Europe is in a lot of trouble economically. In most of the EU, the rates of unemployment are very high.
Yeah.
And the French have lucrative military trade deals with the Russians they don't want to abandon. And of course, the Germans have about 300,000 workers whose jobs are dependent on their economic relations with Russia. So it could be that Putin's hesitancy is that he doesn't want to act in the Ukraine further until he knows that there's no chance of breaking Germany off from the EU or NATO.
Definitely. Let me chime in there a little bit. I find the hypocrisy hilarious by the Western leaders, I guess, if we should call them that. Washington, of course, NATO's influence, the globalist power structure, basically, that they are working together with groups in the Ukraine to attain their goals, that they are basically that they would demonize as the devil incarnate whenever they appear and show or are seen in the West in some way. I'm talking about these nationalist groups that you bring up here specifically. So when it serves their needs, they're willing to work with anybody to achieve their goals, which is very telling, of course. But I wonder again why Russia is so dangerous to them. I know, obviously, you've explained a little bit of this, but is it just because of the threatening of the power monopoly? I mean, they represent a far different power and political ideology today than they did back during the times of the Cold War, right?
Well, you see, it's not a question of whether Russia is a danger. Clearly, they're not. Putin has never made any threatening statements against the United States or Western Europe or anyone else, for that matter. It's this doctrine. It's this Wolfowitz doctrine. It's also the doctrines from Brzezinski, that the United States must prevent ever again the rise of another power that can function as a check on American purposes in the world, because America is the indispensable, exceptional country chosen by history to rule the earth. And this has been given very explicit statement also by the neoconservatives, of whom Wolfowitz is a prime leader. So if you take this doctrine of Brzezinski that the U.S. has to prevent the rise of another power, and in order to do that, the U.S. must control the Eurasian landmass politics, that we can't let Russia control that. The U.S. has to control it. And if you add to that the Wolfowitz doctrine that the prime purpose of U.S. foreign policy is to prevent Russia's rise. Now, of course, they also are applying this to China. Well, then you don't need to have any real threat. What the doctrine is doing is preventing the rise of any power, whether it's a threat or not a threat.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not important. And in that sense, even though it is hypocritical, that doesn't bother them in the least, because they're simply following what they think must be the doctrine of foreign policy that will ensure that the U.S. calls the shots. And of course, they intended to do this through infiltrating the Russian economy and the Chinese economy. With the World Trade Organization, it sort of takes the Russian economy and makes it in some ways subservient to American economic hegemony, financial hegemony, various American enterprises active in Russia. So this was the main idea originally. We'll just suck them into the global economy that we dominate. And in that way, their economic interests will become so dependent on the United States that they'll cooperate with us. But Washington's planned attack on Syria, its effort to set up Iran for attack, both of these things were essentially blocked by the Russian government. And so that caused Washington to say, well, it looks like we're not going to succeed in controlling them the way we thought. So let's take them problems that will play into our hands and problems that will distract them from our purposes elsewhere. So that's the explanation of the Ukraine and what is going on. At the current time, I think initially Washington hoped to grab all of Ukraine and evict Russia from its Black Sea naval base,
Yeah.
because that would leave Russia without a warm water port. It wouldn't be able to defend its base in Syria on the Mediterranean. But that quickly fails. And then the rise of these separatists in eastern Ukraine and also in southern Ukraine. This showed Washington that it would take United States troops or NATO troops to put this down, because Ukraine clearly hasn't the ability. And so I think now they're thinking, look, this is all great. There'll be conflict. We control the explanation, not Russia. The Western media, including the BBC, follows our propaganda. So as this plays out, Russia and Putin get more and more demonized. And if the Ukraine breaks up into lots of separate areas, that's even better. Because it takes a strategic area that has been historically part of Russia away from Russia.
Right.
And so this is what's going on. It's what's playing out, and it's why the government in Kiev, the stooge government, is so provocative. They're forced, or they're instructed in that role by Washington to be as provocative as possible, because it sooner or later will produce more Russian reactions that can be used to demonize Russia and advance the purposes of ending Russian relations with Europe and so on. So that's the story.
Wow, it's a lot going on there, and of course all these little fine, print nuances of how this battle has been fought and the way they try to do it. And of course, I've always gone back to the color revolutions around this region as well, for the sake of trying to, destabilize the old satellite states to Russia, to have them to turn against Russia and ultimately being controlled by, the EU, Washington kind of homogeny, as you said, in that regard. But the neocons, the war agenda there with the Wolfowitz doctrine that you mentioned. Is there any risk here that the United States of America will become, in that regard, the new Soviet empire, that we will see a collapse of it due to the fact that the funding of this machine, the more it spreads out, the weaker it becomes? I mean, there's no talk of even, national defense for America anymore. There's so many troops on foreign soil, and is this going to last in the long run, do you think, economically, financially?
Well, empires are usually expensive. Unless, like the early part of the Roman Empire, that they are extractive, that they gather resources from the lands they dominate in order to support the empire. Now, the United States doesn't work that way. What it does, it gathers resources from American taxpayers in order to support the empire, and these resources are being depleted. We know there's been no economic growth of any significance. Consumer incomes haven't grown for decades. There are no jobs. The Federal Reserve, has been printing huge amounts of money in order to purchase debt. So there's a buildup of debt. There's a huge monetary base sitting in the reserves of the banking system. This worries external holders of dollars. We now see the Russians and Chinese agreeing to trade relations outside the dollar payment system. So the financial basis for the empire is vulnerable. If there was any significant move away from using the dollar to finance balance of payments matters, the demand for dollars in the exchange markets would fall. So the exchange value of the dollar would fall. This would import inflation into the United States, where consumers are already hard pressed and have no real income growth. So the whole thing it could blow up on Washington. On the other hand, they may be able to manage it because they have so many subservient countries, not just Europe, but
Sure.
They've got Canada, Japan, Australia, New Zealand. So how that would work out is unpredictable, but there are vulnerabilities in the financial base of the American empire. And also, We see the rise of China, and we see that under Putin, Russia has recovered from the looting it was subjected to by the United States when the Soviet Empire collapsed.
Yeah.
It essentially was looted by Washington or American corporations. And so since it's recovered in that way, and since China is really rising very rapidly, and China now has all of the American technology, business know-how, has a far larger manufacturing base than the United States, and hasn't any of the economic problems that the United States has. It's going to be very difficult for Washington to implement this Wolfowitz doctrine, this Brzezinski doctrine, this neoconservative doctrine, in order to suppress the rise of Russia and China, particularly as the two countries seem to be forming a strategic alliance. If Russia and China have a strategic alliance, I don't see how there's any prospect for the Wolfowitz doctrine. And so what the danger is that Washington is wedded to this doctrine. It's a very aggressive doctrine. And if they are frustrated and can't impose it, they'll take more and more risk, and they could push the situation into a major war, which of course would be nuclear, because neither side could afford to lose. And it's highly unlikely the United States would have any prospect of winning such a war on conventional terms. Russia and China are just too large, and the populations are too large. A country that can't defeat the Taliban isn't going to defeat the Russian army or the Chinese army, much less the joint combination. And so there's a huge danger there that the Wolfowitz doctrine will lead the world into total destruction, into nuclear war, because of the hubris and arrogance of Washington. You know, if you tell the world that the U.S., I'm indispensable, I'm exceptional, I'm not bound by laws, but all of you are, and the laws come from us. We make them, we decide, and you follow us or else. Now, if you take that position toward the world, which is exactly the position the United States has toward the entirety of the world, you've got a lot of enemies, and you're going to meet a lot of resistance. And this, I think, is, in addition to the economic vulnerabilities of the American empire, doesn't bode well for American purposes in the world. And it doesn't bode well for peace.
Exactly. I mean, obviously, what we know about America from the past, looked at the history. It used to represent some kind of idea of freedom. It was a place where people from the rest of Europe primarily, but also other parts of the world, where they fled to get away from their feudalism, from their difficult conditions, persecutions, and other things. And of course, this is a long gone fairy tale by now. But how do you see the dismantling of such a structure? I mean, it's very interesting to just contemplate on this idea that something like the Wolfowitz doctrine still remains so strong within the power elite and the power structure of those who run the military and ultimately the entire government. Surely there has to be, at some stage, good people coming in place and actually trying to get some other goals achieved. I mean, obviously, ultimately, the issue must be the funding of the system, as you said, in terms of the taxes, and there has to be an American revolt from the people itself against this structure and system, correct?
Well, that assumes that it can be corrected, which is an assumption. An equally likely, or even more likely, outcome is that the system's so corrupt that it can't survive, and that the people themselves are corrupt, and that all Washington is about now is rewarding the interest groups that keep the politicians in power. And they're just a handful of interest groups. There's Wall Street, there's the military security complex, the energy, mining, timber businesses, agribusiness, the Israel lobby. These are the powerful interest groups that the career of senators and representatives and presidents rely on. That's the basis for these careers. And also, it's It's the job prospects of the assistant secretaries, the undersecretaries, the financial regulators. They all are protecting the interest groups from the law in hopes of being rewarded when they leave government with big jobs. So this is why the banks can't be prosecuted for all of the fraud and felonies they committed. And it gave us the financial crisis, you see. It's why the environmental agencies are so weak and can't really protect the environment or the food sources from contamination or from, they can't even achieve labeling of genetically modified organisms. I mean, it's absurd. You can't even get, so you see the entire government is corrupt, and the members of it are concerned with using their position for their own career. And so there's no prospect of any kind of reforming class coming into power. There's no prospect for that in either political party. And we know, we've learned from experience that third parties just don't rise up very easily. And they're easy to demonize because they don't control media.
Yeah.
Their leaders can be set up and arrested because they're powerless. So I think to look for any change in the United States, other than change just from collapse. The dollar can collapse, in which case U.S. power will collapse. It'll be just like Rome. You know, they couldn't maintain their positions. They had to withdraw the legions from Britain. You remember?
Yeah.
And they have to keep withdrawing and withdrawing, and they shrink. And so this is usually the kind of outcome. You don't usually see somebody step in and say, okay, we've all changed our mind, and we now believe in these ancient virtues.
Right.
And we're going to reinstall truth and justice and liberty. The Constitution is dead. They've destroyed every feature of it.
Yep.
And that's what the country is. So it means the country's dead. For all practical purposes, the United States is a corpse, because the United States is the U.S. Constitution. If the Constitution is gone, and it is, the United States is gone. And so there's nothing here but these power groups, very small number, very powerful private interest groups that control the government for the purposes of those interest groups. And those purposes are wedded to the Wolfowitz doctrine, because it means that the extension of American power goes abroad and controls other countries that can be lorded over, can be looted, and can be put under the American financial umbrella. So the whole thing is rotten, and it's likely that it will be resisted by Russia and China. And whether this rotten structure can overcome the resistance of Russia and China, that's the question. That's really the only question.
Now, the collapse, as you mentioned there as well, of course, takes a long time as well. Okay, we're a little bit in more quicker times, if I can put it that way, compared to Roman times. Information moves quicker, so does transportation and everything else. So you'd see an accelerated effect of that. But nonetheless, it's something that doesn't just happen overnight. Usually,
well, it can.
It can. Yeah,
it can happen overnight. Look, the first quarter U.S. GDP growth came in. It was all they could do to monkey the inflation number to give them a 0.1% real growth. So what does that tell you? It tells you the economy has turned down. It means the second quarter is going to be negative. I don't think they'll be able to monkey the official numbers enough to hide the fact that the second quarter is negative. We already see trillions of dollars pulling out of stocks, going into bonds. And this is why interest rates have not gone up despite the cutback of quantitative easing. That is, the Fed has reduced the number of bonds that it purchases every month, but interest rates have not gone up, they've gone down. And the reason is this great shift out of stocks into bonds, because the smart money doesn't trust the stock market when they see a negative quarter approaching. So you've already got in the situation half the population, or not half, 50 million Americans on food stamps. We've seen cutbacks in food stamps. There's a huge number of homeless. There's a lot of houses in foreclosure that haven't technically been foreclosed because the banks don't want it on their books.
Yeah.
We had a report a couple of weeks ago that 83% of this month's university graduates are without jobs. So you fall back into recession when you're already in that kind of a weak situation. This is a crisis. If you're the government and you say, well, let them eat cake, then you're going to have lots of protests,
sure,
social instability. Of course, the government is all prepared to deal with that with force and violence. But that makes it hard for you to continue to pretend that you're the one that represents freedom and justice and democracy and all that sort of thing. So I think the situation may become quite difficult for Washington very soon. And I think that the minute Germany, for example, says, we don't want to be part of this, we're pulling out, we've tried the EU, we've tried the Euro, it doesn't work for us. We've tried NATO, and it just tries to drag us into wars for American empire that we get no benefit from. We're pulling out. Well, that'd be the end of the EU, it'd be the end of NATO. And then the United States, Washington, no longer has any cover. It has to have cover, or else it's seen as a war criminal. So if it doesn't have UN cover, it doesn't have NATO cover, there's no coalition of the willing that it can bribe and threaten, then it's isolated. And this could happen very quickly. I don't think anybody likes the United States. I don't think anybody does. I don't think all the puppet states we have like Washington. They don't like being subservient. They don't like being puppet states.
Right. I don't think they like their own puppets in place either, right? Because I guess this is my other point here. If this collapse were to occur, how do you see the power structure changing then in the future? I mean, the same corrupt interest would bail and jump on any other country or powerful group or corporation, conglomerate, what have you. I mean, the ilks of Wolfowitz, for example, they're not nationalistic tied to America, right? So if you have people operating by proxy puppets, this network exists in other countries, that would just kind of shift the same force, but to another country that happens to be, kind of in a more powerful position at that time, even if that's Russia or China.
I don't think so, because I think there's a huge difference between the United States and between Russia and China. The United States had never experienced a police state. We're just beginning to experience it.
Yeah.
It's been constructed only in the 21st century using 9/11 as the reason, the excuse. But Russia and China both emerged from tyrannies. They know what they are. And the leadership of both countries understand that they have to have the people with them. And so the leadership in both countries are actually trying to improve the situation for people in the countries. That is really the basis for their policies. And that's what they're trying to do. They're not saying, okay, we're going to screw everybody over for the sake of a few interest groups, because the interest groups don't control the Chinese government and they don't control the Russian government. So it's a huge difference between the United States and Russia and China. The Americans were inattentive. They weren't paying attention. They didn't have any experience with tyrannical government, not real tyrannical government. And and so they're very easy to fall asleep and be taken advantage of and being told, oh, we have these terrorists, we've got to protect you by taking away the Constitution and all your rights so that we can act unilaterally and independently of law. We don't care if the law says it's illegal to torture. We can do it anyhow. We don't care that the Constitution gives you these rights. So we don't acknowledge them any longer. We can even kill you on suspicion alone without due process. Well, you see, that's not Russia today. That's not China today. And so you could really see that the hopes of the world switch overnight from the United States to Russia, to China.
Right.
It's not, you know, if you look at the polls of the world, they always show the two greatest threats to peace, the most destabilizing forces. It's always the U.S. is number one, Israel is number two. It's always. And the ones that we say are the axis of evil, you know, North Korea, Iran, they are so low down in the numbers. If you take a worldwide poll, they don't even count. They're not perceived as threats, despite all of Washington's propaganda. Well, that's already the situation. Now, imagine you get a depression here. Imagine the dollar goes, which means you would have depression and inflation simultaneously. No one here would be able to cope.
Yep.
So the whole thing can blow up. And when you run a country basically for evil purposes for so long, you destroy the foundation of the country, the strength, the things that made it a country. Like I say, the Constitution's gone. So I don't think the outcome would be what you suggested. I think the outcome would be the United States would be isolated. It would still have nuclear weapons. It would be very dangerous. The rest of the world would probably become united against it. I think we would lose most of the puppet states. Collapse could be very quick and decisive.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. Now, how do you see, I mean, if you look at Russia today, I kind of mentioned this point earlier a little bit, that they seem to represent a far more conservative force, I guess, than the Trotskyite neocon kind of exportation of the revolution / democracy to the rest of the world, that kind of aggressive attitude, right? Would it be a far better world? Let's say the U.S. collapse and then kind of that's it and no real superpower after that takes over. Would it be a safe place? And I'm not trying to say that the U.S. have represented some kind of stability. We know that it's quite the opposite with the perception of, you know, false terrorism, false flags, and everything else. But how do you see that dynamic changing?
Well, I think that safety would greatly increase because what has the United States done in the 21st century is destroyed about 7 countries.
At least.
Yeah. Some of them totally destroyed, you know, Libya, Iraq, totally destroyed, Somalia. They're in the process of destroying Syria. Pakistan and Yemen have been under attack for years from drones and missiles. And this destabilizes the countries and produces all kinds of, because the governments are cooperating with Washington, allowing Washington to conduct war on aspects of their own populations there. So these countries are being destroyed. They're destabilized. Washington still has Iran in its targets. Now Russia with Ukraine. They're also talking about trying to take NATO into what were the former Central Asian republics of the Soviet Union, into places like Azerbaijan.
Really?
Really, yeah.
Wow.
Georgia, which is already an American puppet. and Washington is doing everything it can to get Europe to accept Georgia. I don't mean the state of Georgia in the United States.
Sure, yeah.
I mean the birthplace of Joseph Stalin.
That's right.
This is now an American puppet state. They were trying to get Europe to accept Georgia into NATO. So, and this threat is recognized by the world. As I said, the polls show the United States is regarded as the principal threat in the world. So, yes, a collapse would remove the principal threat to the world.
Now, let me ask you a little bit more about Israel here. You mentioned AIPAC earlier, of course, the huge Israeli lobby in the U.S. and everything else. Would they accept? Well, I mean, if it happens, it happens. It wouldn't be by their choice anyway. But what do you think that interest groups would do in a scenario like that? If the financial support alone to Israel by the U.S. is removed, that's a huge defeat for them, obviously, right?
The only reason Israel exists is American protection. So if the United States loses its hegemony, then Israel has made so many enemies.
Yeah.
It's just in deep trouble. This is the mistake of saying, I'm based on force, I'm based on violence, I'll beat you down, I'll steal your lands. You just create enemies. And so it means if you lose your protection, you got no friends. The intelligent Israelis have understood this from the beginning and have resisted this policy of dispossessing the Palestinians. And they say, well, this is fine as long as America's protecting us. What if somebody changes their mind? Or what if something happens to their power? Where are we? Why do we do this? Is this necessary? Is this? And it's all an ideology. It's the Zionist ideology. So usually when ideologies take over countries, they destroy themselves. So we have this ideology of American hegemony over the world, and the Israelis have Israeli hegemony over the Middle East, Greater Israel, from the Nile to the Euphrates. Well, these ideologies produce arrogance, hubris, and disregard for others, and disregard for life. And so if power deserts you, you're vulnerable. And that's why I very much oppose the United States policy, because it doesn't do anything but set the country up for failure. It may be able to prevail over people for a long time, but the end result is terrible. It's much better to have goodwill among countries and don't lie about them and don't invade them and don't attack them and don't set them up for attack and don't try to be the ruler of the earth. That means even if you have troubles, even if you do fail, you haven't got enemies. So I don't think the outlook is good for the United States or for Israel, and it's the fault of governments falling to ideologies, or rather, actually, individuals infected with these ideologies being driven to act on them and seize power and bring about these undesirable effects. That's what's happened in the United States. That's what's happened in Israel. It happened in China with Mao. It happened in Russia with Lenin and Stalin.
Yeah.
But they're over it.
They've learned some hard lessons there, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
They're not ideologies any longer. As I said earlier, the governments understand they have to have the people with them, and to have the people with them, they need to act in the people's interest. The United States thinks the people don't count, the interest groups count, they've got the power. Our political career and our career after politics depends on these interest groups, and so we serve their interest, and this ideology is hooked to these interest groups. The neoconservatives ideology suits Israel to a T. It suits the military security complex to a T. It suits Wall Street to a T because it means that Wall Street has financial hegemony over the world. It means the military security complex has endless, huge budgets and endless profits, billions, and more power. So the interest groups are served by the ideology. So that is a dangerous wedding for the world. And it's, in the long run, dangerous for the United States and for its people because it basically implies failure.
Now, let me ask you just a couple of more things here real quick before we begin to wrap things up here. We got to go in a little bit here, but a two-part question, I guess. One would be to kind of more how you see a solution-oriented issue of like how we would actually try to take care of some of our corrupt leadership in the West and actually try to, bring some stability in this scenario. And the other part of that question is quite different. I wanted to bring in another aspect into this because of what's happening in Europe right now, among other places in the world. I wanted to ask if you see the political Islam as being a danger in terms of the expansionist religious phase that it seems to be in right now. We have quite a few Muslim interest groups talking about the active takeover of Europe because of the large increase in the Muslim population there through mass immigration and everything else. How do you view that, Paul?
No, I don't think that that's possible. I think that's just propaganda.
Really? You think so?
Yeah. It's just propaganda. Huh. The reason most of the Muslims are there is they prefer Europe to life under Muslims.
Well, I mean, I'm in Sweden, though, on the front line of this madness. I mean, have you been to Sweden, France, England, Holland lately? I mean, they're not assimilating, though. There are mosques going up all over Europe.
It's not their decision.
Well, they're deciding to build it, though.
Countries decided not to let them assimilate. And so that forces you back on the only thing you have, which is your original culture. So, they were let in vast numbers, largely due to the former empires of Britain and France. I mean, it's the fault of the British Empire. It's the fault of the French colonies.
Well, we didn't get to vote on any of this. No decision making whatsoever. We haven't been part of this. It's that powerful elite at the top making decisions above our heads.
The trouble is, when all those people came in, the elite's decisions didn't go well with the people. The indigenous peoples in France and England. And so it ended up that the immigrants weren't really able to assimilate. And primarily because of the numbers. It were just too great. So, but why did they go there? They did not go there with a plot to take over the countries. They went there because they saw opportunity and not where they were. So they purposely gave up on Islam and Islamic countries to move to the West, where they thought life would be better for them. And so they didn't go there as radical Islamicists with the plot to take over the countries.
Despite there being demonstrations in France, Holland, the UK to bring in Sharia law, use the democratic process to destroy the democratic process?
If you get there, though, and you become unwelcome and you can't get anywhere and you feel the system's operating against you and closing down on you, then you get militant. And I think that that's where the militancy comes from, not from a plot. Now, of course, if these countries continue to have elections and the elections mean anything, and the number of voters rises, then increasingly there'll be Islamicists elected in the parliaments of France and Great Britain, or the United Kingdom as it's called, and in Italy. But that just, the same thing's happening here from the Hispanic immigration. Yeah. We're increasingly, you've got Hispanics in political office, and local as well as federal, and into police forces and so on. So I don't. So we could say, well, was this a plot by the Hispanics to take over America? No, I don't think so.
I think it's quite the opposite. At least if you look at Europe, I see that there is a corrupt leadership there that actually is seeking destabilization of the European countries, clash of civilizations, if you will, of trying to bring this perpetual destabilizing force to the streets of Europe, and there, ergo, you have even a more reason for a police state, for advanced, security apparatus to be built, etc. You have a number of, I think, political dynamics in play there of why that would be beneficial to the global elite that are supranational, national, I guess, who don't have an interest anymore.
That implies more planning and cooperation than I think is possible. I was in Washington for a long time. I was in the government, and just to get a control group, a group in control, to agree to something is very difficult. And so to have all this type of coordination on such a broad front, it's just not feasible. And I don't think the leaderships in Europe, as corrupt as they are, want the kinds of challenge that you're talking about. That's not the challenge they want.
All right.
And in fact, the real problem is that they're owned by Washington. A number of years ago, my dissertation chairman, he ended up the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, and was given the job of winding down the Vietnam War. And he called me in his office, and he wanted me to go to Vietnam to take over the aid programs. And I said I thought it was too late for anything like that. But I used the opportunity to ask him how the United States got so many countries to do its bidding. How, I said, do we get them to do what we want? And he said, money. And I said, oh, you mean foreign aid? He said, no, we just give the leaders bagfuls of money. We own them. They report to us. Now, he was disgusted by it, but there wasn't anything he could do about it because it was the policy and had been. So the real trouble isn't that the Muslims are going to take over Europe. The real trouble is the United States has already taken it over.
Well, with the stay behind, troops and everything else, there's a number of programs after the Second World War, of course, that have been seeking to control Europe, definitely, through NATO.
Taken them over. They report to us. I mean, why do you think Merkel is always doing what Washington wants? It's not in Germany's interest. Why did Cameron want to back the American invasion of Syria, even though the British Parliament said no and voted it down? Why does Hollande, why was he so intent on attacking Syria? What was France going to get out of it? Nothing. So these people, they're owned by Washington. Washington grooms their careers, provides money, provides propaganda, gets them in office. Don't you remember the threat to Sarkozy, the previous French president that we had installed? Sarkozy, the threat was, what was that guy's name? He was head of the IMF.
Strauss-Kahn, yeah?
Yeah, Strauss-Kahn. So what we do, we set him up with these false charges that he raped a maid in a hotel in New York.
Yeah, they hung him out to dry, yeah.
So, and then they had to completely repudiate the charges. But it served to knock him out of the race. It served to demonize him. And he was also a threat to the American use of the IMF because he said, we got to stop these austerity programs. But that's why the U.S. finances the IMF, is the austerity programs, because it drives the countries into debt, and then they're forced to sell off their public assets to Western corporations. So he was in the way of us politically in France, and he was in the way of the American use of the IMF. So they just set him up and destroyed him. But the authorities had to eventually admit that the whole charges were wrong. They couldn't prove any of them, and actually there was some plot by the maid to stick him for a lot of money. So this is the way the United States works. It's always worked this way. Don't you remember the president of Italy back in when was it he revealed this? He revealed that Operation Gladio was a conspiracy between the CIA and Italian intelligence to plant bombs all over Europe, specifically targeting women and children, and blame the communists so that voters would turn away from communists and not vote communist. He said this went on during the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s.
Well, that's kind of, and at the same time, I'm not trying to defend that, but that's kind of understandable considering the threat of communism at the time. If they had the knowledge of how many millions have been killed under the ideology, you can kind of understand that they're afraid of it. And of course, it doesn't mean that their actions of trying to turn against it is right.
The people weren't afraid of it.
I guess that depends on who you ask.
But all that was in the past. It had already been repudiated by Khrushchev in 1956 when he denounced Stalin. And later, of course, in China, Deng Xiaoping and others, Zhou Enlai, they put all kinds of constraints on Mao and the Red Guards and all the rest. So all of that was being forced out. It had already been forced out in Russia. All the type of terror stuff had been stopped when Khrushchev denounced Stalin. So the people were voting communist because the communists said, we won't loot you the way the capitalists do. We'll provide some kind of medical benefit, some kind of job security. Now, I'm not an advocate for communism, but I'm just saying the reason the communism was a threat, it wasn't because people didn't know about the Stalin purges and the Mao purges and so on. But they also knew about what economic life under exploitative capitalism, which uses government.
Exactly.
Who?
Yeah.
This is not free market.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
They knew what that was like. And so the whole purpose of Operation Gladio was to blame things like the Red Brigades and the Bottom Man Half Gang or whatever they were. And we had all of the, it was the first kind of Al Qaeda situation where we get these terror groups. Look, these terror groups. And so all the bombing that went on was done by the CIA and intelligence, not by the communist terror groups. And it was done explicitly to blame the communists so that people wouldn't vote communist. They would vote for our puppets. I remember years ago in my Russian studies, I learned that the Tsarist secret police used to set off bombs and kill people so they could arrest labor organizers. And when I first read it, I didn't believe it. I thought it was propaganda written by liberal historians or pro-Russian historians. But I later asked very conservative people, such as Robert Conquest and my colleague at Stanford, Bertram Wolfe. And they said, oh, yes, that was true. That was quite common. That was the way it worked. The secret police, in order to arrest dissidents or leaders of labor groups trying to form unions, would go blow people up with bombs and blame the dissidents and arrest them. So I think these types of things are far more common than people acknowledge. And if you use this type of thing, then it makes it very difficult to accept anything the government tells you, because it's whatever they tell you is serving their purpose, not the purpose of information or truth.
Well, exactly, and that's a good point of how you use, different organizations at different time to demonize, to create, terror in the population. We've seen this in the past with Gladio, and of course how they're using the dialectic, if you will, in that regard. And I guess that kind of just harkens back a little bit to my point earlier. There's no doubt that there are conflicting interest groups here, but no matter how the European top actually is viewing their own tactics, whether they know what they are doing or not, I believe firmly, after doing quite a few years of research on this now, that they know what they're doing. But it's clear that we see no interest by the leadership to have the large and increasingly numbers of immigrants coming into Europe, specifically Muslims, to assimilate. Assimilation is a dirty word now, and I think that this is welcomed by the Muslims as well. They like that they can actually live just like they did in the country that they fled from, but now in Europe, in their own territory, just like in the good old days of British colonization that you mentioned, but quite in the reverse in this case. But it's funny how some people think that two wrongs in some kind of mysterious way make a right, kind of like a revenge for something that the current population in Europe didn't have anything to do with. But the reason I bring this up is because we have the quotes by interest groups like Paideia out of Sweden, the likes of Barbara Specter and Annette Kahn in Germany, for example, are actively seeking to destroy Europe with mass immigration. Even Coudenhove-Kalergi, the founder of the Pan-European movement, talked about the destruction of the European race in his book Practical Idealism back in 1924. But let me get to my point here. There is a huge component here where I think people who haven't looked into this are actually missing out, especially when we consider the coming religious conflicts, the opposition between some of the values in the West and the Islamic values as well. Whether those naive politicians actually advocating this complete open border policy realize what kind of situation they're creating or not, some definitely do, and they welcome this change and that this is happening. And for those who don't know and haven't visited Europe or haven't been there in 10 years or so, I urge you to look into it and actually see what has been going on recently. Please do. Please investigate. I think that you have no idea of what actually is going on and what kind of ramp up to cultural conflicts that we're seeing on the streets in Europe as another method to the very same destabilization that you talked about before with Gladio, for example. I see it in the same manner, but as we know, they use the same MO, but with new characters. Kind of like an update in a way. They know that people see through it after a while. So this is a new angle to it. This is a new component that will lead to that very same, issuance of a security state and terrorism and everything else. And just because 9/11 was an inside job, it doesn't mean that there aren't a real threat and an aspect of colonization from the point of view of some, Muslims group. I think it's very naive not to contemplate that aspect and realize actually what's going on there. So I urge everyone just to look into it. But Paul, as we begin to wrap things up here for this time, though, please give us your details about your websites and whatnot. Maybe there's an additional comment you want to make to this, but please share with us where people can go to find more of your writings. And of course, if there's anything else you want to add to that, please go ahead.
Well, I think we've finished the topic. My website is just paulcraigroberts.org. And they can find plenty of articles to read there and see what the books are and so on. And I appreciate your sharing your audience with me, and I hope this discussion is not too realistic for listeners.
No worries about that.
People don't really want to know as much as sometimes I'm prepared to tell them.
I've noticed that too. As soon as you get in and talking about truthful matters, that it gets uncomfortable. People shy away way too quickly. But no, you're right. Okay, paulcraigroberts.org. That's the website. Head on over there to check that out. A lot of interviews, and you can catch Paul on RT and a number of other channels as well. Great having you on. Thank you for your time today, sir. Really good having you. Thank you. I hope we can do it again in the future.
Well, of course. Thank you.
I just have a few additions to make regarding some of the last points that were discussed in the program, specifically related to the claims regarding colonialism. In this case, the British and the French was brought up, but I want everyone to contemplate why it is that if we accept the arguments that the current multicultural madness is a revenge due to something that ended long before most of us were born, how is this fair or making things right? Furthermore, why is it that the current populations and citizens of the Western countries troubled by this malignant ailment of multicultural madness are now collectively to suffer from something that the aristocracy, the elite, and the military within these countries did above the heads of the people? None of this was democratically achieved. We were all more or less servants in these empires. Again, that's like blaming Americans for what the American military and the politicians are doing. Or this is like blaming America for something that AIPAC is deciding in terms of foreign policy above the heads of Americans. Sure, it's their battle to fight and their attempt to try to detopple those who've taken over the country and now running it against people's wills. But this is now occurring. much in the same way that the colonial times of Europe and the West ended as well. History speaks of all people taking part in conquest, slavery, wars over territory and resources. We've had this way of life longer than we've not had it. And by attempting to reverse the colonialism in a backward fashion, this is now somehow the virtuous thing to do. We have covered the issues of colonialism in a couple of shows recently, and I urge everyone to go into our archives and listen to our programs with, for example, Dr. Ricardo Duchesne, that not only questions the era of colonialism, but also actually puts it on its head with accurate history and completely deconstructing everything that we've been told and learned consequently in Western universities about our history ever since. And specifically, that it only brought murderous, crazy white people that were frothing at the mouth to enslave others and somehow squeeze out wealth from them. This is, frankly, an outdated and historically inaccurate stereotype that has proven to be a outdated mold that many people have a difficulty letting go of. Furthermore, if England and France was responsible, why is this happening in Sweden, in Norway, in Denmark, and all the other countries who were not taking part in the type of colonialism that we saw out of England, France, Holland, etc.? For example, why is it happening in Ireland, where the majority of slaves actually came from when it comes to serving in the British and the American colonies? That's right, the Irish were slaves. A lot of Irish were slaves. Take the example of Belgium and King Leopold II, for example, a cousin of Queen Victoria of Britannia, and his nice hand-chopping rubber empire down there in Congo. How is the Belgian people responsible for this? And why are we not talking about royal psychopathy and that this is somehow something that all the people were responsible for? This went over the heads of all the people within the Western countries. This is collectivism at its worst, one size fits all, and that you're all to blame. Furthermore, if this is the stance, then there is an admission that the open border policy that we have now actually do create problems and causes issues, and this is what so many people actually are happy about. So it's an admission to the fact that this is creating problems and tremendous infighting within the cultures. I'm reminded of the old Masonic slogan, Ordo ab Chao, order out of chaos, that out of the chaos that the elite will create, they will consequently create their order. That's what this is all about. I do not see how the sadistic viewpoint that somehow more suffering and more problems is going to create a better world and a more balanced environment for all of us. I don't see how that's a valid argument, frankly. So this is something that needs to be revised if we are to look at history accurately, and if we are to take into account what actually is happening in the West right now and how the chaos that we've seen created in the West has been intentional and how this serves a greater purpose. I think there would be actually a valuable insight into all of us to actually realize what actually is going on in the West and what the reasoning behind this is and what kind of conditions the elite is seeking to create. And if we do not see through that but continue to support these activities because, we have some need to make up for the taught and entrained guilt that we are supposed to feel in the West for the one-sided history that we are taught, well, then we're doing not only ourselves but everyone actually a huge disservice, and we are not seeing through the lies, and we're not seeing through the current game plan. So time to revise, time to update our history here. We have another program, of course, with Israel Shamir on the very same topic that we discussed today. I recommend you check that out. We have many other programs on these kinds of topics coming in the future. Please look in our archive as well and check out some of the shows that we have there for you. The main website is redicecreations.com. That's where you can find our free radio show, news, videos, and much more. And then, of course, we have redicemembers.com, where you can find our full archives. You can go there to sign up and stream or download all our previous shows in full. We have over 850 programs going back to 2006. A lot of stuff in the archives for you. All right, we have more shows coming up here with Harry Cooper from Shark Hunters. We have Don Park from Sweden, the street artist who was arrested for his art. That speaks to some of the points that we kind of got into here a little bit as well. We also have Frank Salter, Gregory Sams, Joseph Atwill, Richard Dolan, John Rappaport, and Joseph P. Farrell, to name a few. All right. Well, thanks for listening. Have a great day, everyone. We'll be back in just a few days. Until then, take care, keep questioning, and keep thinking. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.